Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sutta study with Bhante Suddasu. This morning we will be doing the Moḷiyaphagguna Sutta, and you can find the link in the live chat. And welcome to Elaine. Good morning. Hello, Richard. Hello, Ethan, Bradley, Sally, Ela, and Jens. And welcome to everyone else that I can't see. Oh, hello, Yevin. Welcome. Always good to see people up at 8 a.m. on Sunday morning to study the teachings of the Buddha. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. All right. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bhante so we can start our sutta study. Hello, Gita. Welcome. Oh, 1 second. Oh, hello, Buddha Ruchi. All right.
It's Michael. Buddha Ruchi, it's Michael.
Oh, hi, Michael.
Yeah. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Good morning, friends. So today we'll be looking at the Moḷiyaphagguna Sutta, which is from the Samyutta Nikaya, the Nidana Samyutta, which is the chapter on dependent origination, on Paticca Samuppada. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and give some explanation, and I'll have some discussion at the end. This is a relatively short sutta, but it touches on some very deep subjects. So this might require a fair bit of discussion in order to fully pull out the meaning. So we'll see how this goes. The sutta begins, At Savatthi, monks, these are the 4 kinds of food which maintain beings that have come into existence and support those who are seeking existence. What 4? Edible food, whether coarse or subtle. Sense contact is the 2nd. Mental volition is the 3rd. Consciousness is the 4th. Monks, these are the 4 kinds of food which maintain beings that have come into existence and support those who are seeking existence. So the Buddha here is introducing the concept of the 4 ahara, as it's called in Pali. So ahara literally means intake. What you take into yourself. And the 4 are, one is physical, so physical food, physical sustenance. Sustenance is another way you could translate ahara, 4 kinds of sustenance. And then the other 3 are mental. So sense contact, so we take in sensory experiences. Volition. So volition is a bit different in that it's something we create within ourselves. We create intentions. We create volition. We create willpower within ourselves. And consciousness, which is the most challenging of these to understand, so that we feed on consciousness. The consciousness is something which sustains and keeps us going in the same way that physical food sustains us and keeps us going. So the 4 aharas is commonly translated as nutriment. I chose not to use the word nutriment because it's a really weird word that is hardly ever used in ordinary English speech. It's a word which is quite rare. In fact, I had never encountered the word nutriment before I got into studying the suttas. So I was quite puzzled about its use. So I just don't want to use that word since it's, again, extremely rare in English. So elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha goes into much more detail on the four ahara, the four kinds of sustenance or food. Here he introduces it quite briefly, and the rest of the sutta is mostly about paticca samuppada. It's mostly about dependent origination. So he introduces the four ahara, and then the sutta continues. When this was said, Venerable Moḷiyaphagguna said to the Blessed One, Bhante, who feeds on consciousness food? And the Buddha replies, that is not a valid question, the Blessed One said. I do not say one feeds. If I said one feeds, then this would be a valid question. Bhante, who feeds on consciousness food? But I do not say that. Since I do not say that, if someone asked, Bhante, what is consciousness food for? That would be a valid question. And the proper explanation would be, consciousness is the food based on which there is the production of further existence in the future. And when that has come to be, then there are the six senses. And based on the six senses, there is sense contact. So in other words, Venerable Moḷiyaphagguna is asking, he's asking, who is the being which feeds on consciousness food? So who is it that relies on consciousness in order to continue to exist? So Venerable Moḷiyaphagguna is assuming the existence of some kind of ongoing, persistent, separate individual being. He's presuming the existence of some kind of persistent self or soul, independent of consciousness, independent of the body, independent of the five khandhas, independent of the five components of body and mind. So this is what the Buddha is rejecting. He's saying the Buddha is rejecting the question because the question implies the existence of some kind of persistent, self-existent entity. So this is what the Buddha is rejecting. And so he says the proper question to ask is, what is it that consciousness sustains the existence of? What is it that consciousness feeds and gives basis for? And he says consciousness is the food based on which there is further existence in the future. Based on that, we get the six senses. Based on the six senses, there's sense contact. So here he's plucking a few stages from paticca samuppada. So in paticca samuppada, we have avijja paccaya sankhara. So from ignorance, there are conditional phenomena. Sankhara paccaya vijnana. Based on conditional phenomena, there is consciousness. Vijnana paccaya nama rupam. Based on consciousness, there is mind and body, which here, instead of mind and body, nama rupa, instead the Buddha says, ayating punabhava abhinibhattiya, which means a further existence in the future, the production of further existence in the future. So in other words, he's saying that consciousness is the basic fuel for continuing to have the experience of self-existence. And then based on that, we have the six senses. So production of further existence in the future in this part of the sutta is a stand-in for mind and body. It's a stand-in for nama rupa. So in the standard dependent origination, we say based on consciousness, there is mind and body. Based on mind and body, there is the six senses. Based on the six senses, there is sense contact. Here the Buddha is saying, based on consciousness, there is the production of further existence in the future. And based on that, then there's the six senses. And based on the six senses, there is sense contact. So in other words, just to be clear here, that when he says further existence in the future, he means the arising of mind and body. So the appearance of a mind and body in the future. So the issue here is, so it's not consciousness per se That's the problem. But it's identifying consciousness as me. So when we identify consciousness as me, then that's what gets us caught in this cycle of, well, I am conscious. What is it I am conscious of? I am conscious of sankharas. How am I conscious? I am conscious through the operation of mind and body. And how does mind and body support consciousness? Well, through the six senses, through eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. So this creates the experience of individual existence. But it's not a being in the sense of a persistent, self-existent entity that exists independently of consciousness, that exists independently of mind and body, that exists independently of the six senses. It's not based on such a being. This is what the Buddha is rejecting. The Buddha is rejecting the idea of a self-existent entity independent of and separate from consciousness, separate from mind and body. But rather, it's that when consciousness is present, and this is, once again, the consciousness that arises from the fundamental delusion of self-existence, the fundamental delusion of separation. When that consciousness is present, then based on it, there arises mind and body. And based on that, there is the six senses. And based on that, there is sense contact. So the Buddha is laying out a causal process, showing how one step leads to another, but that there doesn't need to be an independent, self-existent entity separate from those components in order to explain them. Again, coming back to the metaphor, the simile that Ajahn Punadhammo likes to use, the simile of the goblin in the car. So I introduced the simile the other day, but I'll explain it briefly again because it's quite helpful to understand what the Buddha is saying here. So in the simile, there's a car and there's a person who doesn't understand how cars work at all. So they have a belief that there's a goblin who lives inside the car and which makes the car run. And then his auto mechanic friend comes along and says, no, there's no goblin that makes the car run. It's the engine. The engine makes the car run. And so the first person says, well, then the goblin must live inside the engine in order to make the engine run. And the auto mechanic says, no, it's the pistons driving the crankshaft that makes the engine run. And the first person says, well, then the goblin must be driving the pistons so that the engine can run. And the auto mechanic says, well, no, that's the ignition of the fuel caused by the spark plug. That's what makes the pistons run. Then the first person says, oh, well, the goblin must be the person who's lighting the spark plug in order to ignite the fuel. So the goblin's in the spark plugs. And so this continues with the auto mechanic gradually explaining all the interrelated components of the car until eventually the first person realizes that the car operates without there needing to be a little goblin living inside who makes it operate. That the car operates as a system of interdependent components which support each other, which rely upon each other in order to have a functioning vehicle. So in the same way, the Buddha here is laying out how there is the illusion of self-existence arising from mutually dependent components, mutually dependent parts. This causal process in which several different components rely upon each other to create the illusion of an independent being. So then Moḷiyaphagguna, however, did not get it. So Moḻiyaphagguna asks another question. He says, Bhante, who contacts? In other words, the Buddha speaks about sense contact. And Moḻiyaphagguna is saying, well, who senses things? So if there's eye, who is it that's seeing? If there's ear, who is it that's hearing? And so on. And of course, the Buddha replies, that is not a valid question. The Blessed One said, I do not say one contacts. If I said one contacts, then this would be a valid question. Bhante, who contacts? But I do not say that. Since I do not say that, if someone asked, Bhante, what is the condition for sense contact? Then that would be a valid question. And the proper explanation would be, based on the 6 senses, there is sense contact. And based on sense contact, there are feelings. So here again, the Buddha is taking a little piece from Paticca Samuppada. He's saying that when the 6 senses are present, then there can be sense contact. So when there is eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, then there can be seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and cognizing. But that doesn't mean that there is a persistent, self-existent entity who senses things. Another example of this would be that, again, coming to cars, these days modern cars have motion sensors and proximity detectors, so that, for example, when you're backing up your car to park, if you're getting too close to the car behind you, then the proximity detector will start giving off a warning signal, like, oh, you're getting too close, you need to stop. So then Moḻiyaphagguna would ask, well, who is it in the car that senses you're too close to the car behind you so that it knows to tell you you're too close? Who is the being that knows you're too close to the car behind you? But there is no being in the car that knows you're too close to the car behind you. Rather, it's that when the conditions are right, it sets off the proximity detector. And the proximity detector issues its warning. So it has nothing to do with a sentient being living inside the car. In fact, anyone who's driven on the highways probably doubts that there's any sentient beings in most of the cars. But rather, it's just, again, a causal process. When the conditions are right, namely, there's a proximity detector in the car, and the car is too close to the one behind it, then the warning is issued. So it's a conditional process, a causal process. So in the same way, when there is the 6 senses and there is an object present, then sense contact arises. Actually, elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha gives a bit more detailed of an explanation as to how sensory contact occurs. And he pieces apart 4 distinct components, actually 5 distinct components. So there's the sense organ, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, sense object, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, thought, and consciousness. There must be consciousness present as well. And then the meeting of those 3 is sense contact. And based on sense contact, then Vedana arises, a feeling arises. A total of 5 distinct components to sensory experience. And normally in day-to-day life, we get them all muddled up and mixed together. But with sharp attention, it's possible to pick them apart and to identify each of the 5 components separately and to see how all of them meeting together is the experience that we think of as sensing, as sense contact, sensory experience. But once again, none of this relies upon the existence of a persistent self-being. It's simply when these conditions are present, then there is sense contact. So Moḻiyaphagguna, on the other hand, still doesn't get it. So he asks Bhante, who feels? And the Buddha replies, that is not a valid question. Moḻiyaphagguna is apparently a little thick in the head. That is not a valid question, the Blessed One said. I do not say one feels. If I said one feels, then this would be a valid question. Bhante, who feels? But I do not say that. Since I do not say that, if someone asked, Bhante, what is the condition for feeling? Then that would be a valid question. And the proper explanation would be, based on sense contact, there are feelings, and based on feelings, there is craving. So continuing with dependent origination, and now we're getting into dangerous territory. So there is sense contact, let's say seeing, and based on seeing, there is feeling. So if we see something that we have a tendency to like, then we will identify it as pleasant. If we see something that we have a tendency to dislike, we will identify it as unpleasant. And if we see something that we don't have a strong tendency towards either way, then we'll identify it as neutral. So this is what we call Vedana, or feeling. It's that very quick, almost automatic response of labeling an experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So for example, let's say that you're eating cake and you put a spoonful of cake in your mouth and there's a pleasant feeling. It's like, oh, this is nice. Well, that's coming from your underlying tendency to like that kind of cake. So it's not that the cake is inherently pleasant, but rather it's that you have a habit of liking cake. And that habit might come from past lives. So it might be buried very deep in the subconscious where we don't normally identify it, where we think it's simply the way things are. But it's coming from a habit, a tendency to respond in a particular way to sensory experience. So based on sense contact, there are feelings, and based on feelings, there is craving. So craving is wanting something. So you have a sensory experience. So in this case, you put a spoonful of cake in your mouth, and based on your underlying tendency to like it, it's registered as pleasant. And then since it's pleasant, we want more. We want more of this pleasant experience. So that's craving. So craving is not an automatic response to feeling. We do have a choice here. There's also a choice between sense contact and feeling, by the way, as the Buddha makes clear in other suttas. We can choose to perceive things as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, depending on what we wish. But that's much more subtle. That's much more difficult. The step between feeling and craving is a little bit easier. Still quite difficult, but a little easier. So when there is a feeling, for example, in this case, a pleasant sensation from putting cake in your mouth, pleasant sensation, then you notice that tendency to want more. And instead, we practice contentment, being okay with just this moment the way it is. Then there's no problem. And craving does not arise. And it's the same with unpleasant sensation, of course. With unpleasant sensation, when we have a craving to end the sensation, to avoid the sensation. And with neutral sensation, we mostly have a craving to ignore it, or a craving for something more interesting, something different. So craving can operate in regard to all three kinds of feeling. But once again, it doesn't automatically happen. So there's an extra condition required here, which is not specifically mentioned in dependent origination. For feeling to produce craving, there must also be the condition of delusion, the condition of ignorance. And in specific, the delusion of conditional happiness must be operating. The delusion of if I get more pleasant things, then I'll be happy. If I avoid unpleasant things, then I will be happy. If I get more interesting things, then I will be happy. That delusion of conditional happiness must be operating. So that's another hidden condition at this particular step, independent origination. So it's not enough just to have sense contact and feelings. In order for craving to arise, there must also be that delusion of conditional happiness. There must be that lack of self-awareness, that lack of self-restraint, which allows one to fall into craving, which allows craving to manifest at this step. So if that condition is absent, if one does not have the delusion of conditional happiness, then feeling will just terminate at feeling. There will be no craving. So Moḷiyaphagguna still doesn't get it, so he asks another one of his bad questions. He asks, Bhante, who craves? And the Buddha replies, that is not a valid question. The Blessed One said, I do not say one craves. If I said one craves, then this would be a valid question. Bhante, who craves? But I do not say that. Since I do not say that, if someone asked, Bhante, what is the condition for craving? Then that would be a valid question. And the proper explanation would be, based on feeling there is craving, and based on craving there is grasping. So again, it's not necessary for there to be a person, a persistent, self-existent entity independent of the six senses, independent of mind and body, independent of consciousness. But rather one recognizes when feelings appear and there is also present the condition of delusion, of unrestrained habits, then craving manifests. So there doesn't need to be a person, a self-existent entity who decides to start craving things. It's just a natural unfolding of when these conditions are present, namely a feeling and the underlying tendency. It's called anusaya in Pali, anusaya, underlying tendency. Avidya, so ignorance, or moha, delusion, so this underlying misunderstanding of reality, which is actually implied in dependent origination from the beginning. So dependent origination starts with avidya, starts with ignorance. So every step of the process is tainted by ignorance, afflicted by ignorance. So once again, that's the implicit statement that runs all through dependent origination, which is when you are delusional, this is how things unfold. This is how the conditions unfold. When delusion is present, then conditions unfold in this way. That's the basic statement of dependent origination. So the Buddha says, based on feeling, there is craving, and based on craving, there is grasping. So when there is a feeling in the mind of a mind afflicted by delusion, the delusion of conditional happiness, as I was saying earlier, then there is craving. There's craving for more of that conditional happiness. And based on that craving for more conditional happiness, there's grasping, which is trying to hold on to things, trying to get things and hold on to things. So we have a pleasant sensation, we try to keep it going. We have an unpleasant sensation, we try to grasp at something pleasant. We have a neutral sensation, we try to grab something interesting. So this is grasping. It's trying to get something more appealing, more enjoyable. Or if something enjoyable is already happening, we try to keep it going. We try to make it persist. And Moḷiyaphagguna once again doesn't get it and asks, Bhante, who grasps? He must think he's very clever. But the Buddha is not amused. The Buddha replies, or maybe he is amused. Maybe we could read this as the Buddha being amused. That is not a valid question, the Blessed One said with a smile and a laugh. Actually, no, I don't read it that way at all. I read it as the Buddha being like, oh dear Lord, here he goes again. The Buddha says, that is not a valid question, the Blessed One said. I do not say one grasps. If I said one grasps, then this would be a valid question. Bhante, who grasps? But I do not say that. Since I do not say that, if someone asked, Bhante, what is the condition for grasping? Then that would be a valid question. And the proper explanation would be, based on craving, there is grasping, and based on grasping, there is existence. This is how the entire mass of suffering arises. So here the Buddha is pointing out the next step. So based on craving, there is grasping, and based on grasping, there is existence. So in Pali, tanha paccaya upadana, upadana paccaya bhavo. So bhava, here it's translated simply as existence. Elsewhere, you'll see it translated as becoming or as being. And in the context of dependent origination, this is specifically talking about the experience of self-existence, the experience of existence as an individual. So ego existence. So at this point, we have a full-fledged entity, or the illusion of a full-fledged entity. So we have a being which has body and mind, it has six senses, it has sensory contact, it has feelings, it likes some things and dislikes others, it craves some things and craves to avoid others, it grasps at some things and tries to avoid experiencing other things. So all of that comes together to form an identity. I am the person who likes chocolate. I am the person who doesn't like chocolate. I am the person who desperately wants to be famous. I am the person who desperately wants to live by myself in the woods. Whatever it is. It's our full-fledged sense of self, based upon the presence of all the preceding conditions of body and mind. So this is what we mean by bhava. It's this deeply rooted self-identity. So it's not existence in the sense of attita, as we spoke about in the Kachana Gota Sutta, the more fundamental concept of whether something exists or not. But bhava rather refers to the self-identity, self-existence, the persistent feeling, I exist, there is me. So that's what it's referring to. Then there's a little peculiarity here in the text. So there is a marker in the text which indicates that something was removed, something was cut out because it was a repetition, but it's not clear what exactly was cut out. So normally I would restore the piece that's been cut out of the sutta, but in this case it's not clear what exactly was cut out, so I didn't restore anything, because any restoration would be supposition. It would not be guaranteed to be accurate. But just be aware that something has been cut out. So as I wrote here in the footnote, most likely it then included the next two steps of dependent origination. So based on existence, there is birth. Based on birth, there is decay, dying, sorrow, lamentation, pain, depression, and anguish. However, once again, it's not guaranteed that that was included at this point in the text. So for example, that elision marker might also indicate that Moḷiyapagguna's questioning continued, within him asking Bhante who exists, and then the Buddha says, based on existence, there is birth. And then Moḷiyapagguna saying, well, who is born? And the Buddha carrying on from there. It's possible. We don't know. Again, since it's not clear what was cut out of the text, I just left it as an elision rather than filling anything in. So this is a feature that you'll find in a number of places in the suttas. If you start reading them in Pali in particular, you'll find that in many, many places throughout the suttas, there was abbreviation of the canonical text itself, which usually it's pretty clear what the abbreviation was, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not clear what was abbreviated. which is a bit disappointing at times, such as in this case, it's a bit disappointing. But this is what we have to work with, so we do our best. Then the Buddha concludes, he says, however, Phaguna, when through dispassion the six senses completely cease, then sense contact ceases. When sense contact ceases, feeling ceases. When feeling ceases, craving ceases. When craving ceases, grasping ceases. When grasping ceases, existence ceases. When existence ceases, birth ceases. When birth ceases, decay, dying, sorrow, lamentation, pain, depression, and anguish cease. This is how the entire mass of suffering ceases. So here we have a somewhat slimmed down version of the cessation half of dependent origination. So the Buddha skipped the first 4 steps. So normally it starts with the complete cessation through dispassion of ignorance. Then there was the cessation of sankharas, the cessation of consciousness, the cessation of mind and body, and then the cessation of 6 senses. But the Buddha started directly at the 6 senses. But it's important to keep in mind that an arhat, a fully enlightened being, still has 6 senses. The 6 senses are still operating. Sense contact is still operating. Feeling is still operating. However, craving and grasping are not operating, and they do not have the delusion of self-existence, and they are not subject to birth and depression and anguish and so on. So what could the Buddha be talking about here? There's 2 main theories. One is that when he's talking about the 6 senses completely ceasing and so on, he's talking about the 6 senses when affected by delusion, when affected by ignorance. Keeping in mind that dependent origination starts with the phrase avidya paccaya. So based on ignorance, this whole process unfolds. So one interpretation is that dependent origination is only describing the experience of unenlightened beings. It's only describing the experience of beings who are afflicted by avidya, who are afflicted by delusion and ignorance. Therefore, dependent origination does not describe arhats and Buddhas. It does not describe awakened beings. So while they still may be manifesting a mind and body and 6 senses, they are not displaying paticca samuppada because they have no avidya, they have no ignorance. Therefore, the unfolding causal process that we see here cannot unfold in them because the fundamental first condition is absent. So although they have 6 senses, it is not conditioned by ignorance. Therefore, it does not produce the 12-fold chain of paticca samuppada. That's one interpretation, and I think that's the most likely. Another interpretation is that the cessation half is referring to a single moment of experience, a moment in which one's dispassion becomes strong enough that one temporarily loses one's 6 senses. The 6 senses temporarily cease to exist entirely. In other words, one has a direct, complete immersion into the nibbana dhatu, a direct, complete immersion into emptiness, in which everything that one identifies as me or mine is seen to cease, seen to cease existing. Seen to be empty of inherent existence. So in that moment, there's that breakthrough of recognizing, since everything that I identify as me is empty, then it can't possibly be me. And therefore, whatever happens with it, whatever happens with the causal conditional process, cannot produce dukkha for me. So I am not touched by this dukkha. That's another interpretation, which is also quite valid, though, again, I tend to lean towards the first interpretation. So that's the end of this sutta. So At this time, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and type them in the live chat, and I'll answer them to the extent of my ability. Thank you.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, Bante, for your teachings. And welcome to Marielle, Dan, Suzanne, and all other friends. So Bradley is asking, does dependent origination fall under right view?
Yes.
It's easier for me to follow the car simile when it comes to the sort of mechanic aspects of a car, fuel, engine, sensor. But when it comes to craving, grasping, ignorance, etc., those are sort of ethereal or heady. Why is there ignorance? I know the Buddha says the aspects of dependent arising turn around on each other, but it's hard to fathom that there's no beginning point.
Well, first off, I actually find it really wonderful to reflect that the mind is a mechanical operation of interlinking parts, just like a car or a machine. I actually find that quite helpful. So we tend to have this underlying assumption that the mind is this like ethereal thing which is totally random and just does whatever it wants. But the Buddha is quite clear that that's not true. That the mind also is a causal machinery which depends upon particular conditions in order to operate in particular ways. So what's a bit different is that we have the ability to make choices which have a strong immediate effect on the functioning of the mind and a lesser proxy effect on the operating of the body. But otherwise, again, we can see the unfolding of causal processes in the mind based upon conditions. So yes, the mind is a interrelated piece of machinery, just like a car or a clock. The difference is that we have the ability to get in there and fuss around with things if we want to, which is good news because that's how you attain enlightenment. And what was the second part of this question?
Why is there ignorance? I know that Buddha says the aspects of dependent origination turn around on each other, but it's hard to fathom that there's no beginning point.
Is there a beginning point to a circle? And yet we can fathom the existence of a circle. The Buddha said, there is no discoverable beginning to samsara. There doesn't need to be. We're used to thinking of things having beginnings and ends, but that's only one way to conceive of things.
And Kevin says, Sukha parideva dukkha do manasa upayasa. Wow, what a word.
Yeah, lots of fun. Well, that's a compound word, actually. It's composed of five different words.
And Bradley is also asking, what's the Pali for cessation through dispassion? Usually see it as with the remainder less fading away.
Yeah, so the Pali word is asesa viraga nirodha, which is a word compound. So asesa means remainderless. So sesa means remainder, and means none. So asesa means no remainder. Viraga, this was something that I've started tinkering with in translation relatively recently. So previously I had gone off the old custom of translating the word viraga as fading away in certain places in the suttas. But recently I started going back and looking at those sections because the word viraga literally means without lust. That's what it literally means. Viraga means no lust, without lust. And virtually everywhere in the canon, the Buddha uses this in a way that clearly means dispassion, the absence of lust. Especially when he's talking about the attainment of awakening. He's talking about dispassion leads directly to liberation. Viraga vimuchati. We see this phrase over and over throughout the suttas. Dispassion liberates. Eliminating one's lust leads to enlightenment. We see this all over the place. So I started going back and looking at those places where other translators have translated viraga as fading and asking, well, would this passage make similar sense if we translate that as dispassion, as the word literally means? And I realized that actually virtually every single place in the canon it does. It makes just as much sense, if not more sense, to translate viraga as dispassion rather than fading. So that's also my feeling here. So the remainderless fading, the remainderless cessation based on dispassion, rather than remainderless fading away and cessation. So remainderless cessation based on dispassion makes sense. It's a statement which you could see anywhere in the suttas using exactly the same words, and it would make total sense. It would fit perfectly with the suttas. Whereas having it as fading away and cessation, well, that doesn't really add any information. It doesn't add anything useful. So while a potentially valid translation, it always struck me as a little bit strange. Whereas fading away based on dispassion or because of dispassion, cessation based on dispassion, that makes a lot more sense to me. That seems to be fitting with the Buddha's overall message much more clearly. And once again, based on the Pali language, it also makes more sense. The word viraga, once again, literally means dispassion. It means without lust. So translating it, like turning the word without lust into the word fading away, always seemed quite strange to me. I'm not a fan. I hope that clears that up.
Right, and we have quite a few questions on that. So Kevin also has another translation question. Any specific reason you don't close the statement, this is how the entire mass of suffering arises, with a quotation mark?
So this is a style convention, which is when you have a quotation of speech which extends over multiple paragraphs, then you do not have an end quote at the end of each paragraph. This is to indicate that it's one continuous statement. Whereas if you put the end quote at the end of each paragraph, then it would imply that there was a new speaker at the beginning of each paragraph. So if I'd included an end quote, then the assumption would be that the last paragraph was being spoken by somebody other than the Buddha, and that would not be appropriate.
Right. And Jens says, it seems as we develop awareness, we see wanting things to bring happiness or avoiding things that brings us unhappiness. It's really like holding on to a hot coal. Is this when or how Nirodha occurs?
That's how dispassion starts to occur. But actually the precondition for dispassion is disenchantment. So disenchantment is when you're still holding on to the hot coal, but you start to lose interest in holding on to it. You're like, actually, this kind of hurts. I don't think I want to do this anymore. That's disenchantment. And dispassion is when you actually drop it. You drop the coal.
And Dan says, is ceases different to not exist? The nearby Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya 1215, suggests exists or not exists is a confused view.
Yeah, that's an important point. So again, the Kachanagota Sutta that you're referring to, I went over that a couple of weeks ago, I think, which I think actually is my favorite sutta in the entire canon. So that actually is my number one, as I've mentioned on a number of occasions. That's number one for me. There, the Buddha is using the word attita and natita. So attita literally means there isness, so the quality of something existing, of being existent. And natita is the quality of it not existing. So there he's talking about the absolute nature of something either absolutely existing or absolutely not existing. And he's saying that this doesn't apply but rather under certain conditions, something will appear to exist, and under other conditions, it will appear to not exist. That's what he's talking about. He's saying that things fundamentally don't either exist or not exist, but rather under certain conditions, they will appear to exist. That's what he's talking about. As for the word nirodha, so the word nirodha, it's usually translated as cessation. So again, there can be the experience of something ceasing based on conditions. That has nothing to do with whether or not that thing absolutely exists or absolutely does not exist. It has to do with our subjective experience of whatever is happening. So it's important not to get subjective experience mixed up with objective reality. Okay?
And then also ask, does an enlightened being have a preference to end dependent origination, or is it just the Buddhas and arhats that have developed equanimity and have no preference for the arising or passing in the chain?
So when I say enlightened being, I'm talking about arhats and Buddhas. In some Buddhist lineages, they use the word enlightenment in a much vaguer, broader, more general sense. So you might encounter this, for example, in especially translations from the Chan school. I've come across, and this initially was quite puzzling for me until I saw the Chinese words that were being translated in that way. So what I realized is that there's a particular Chinese word, which just means a temporary opening of the mind, but which gets translated by some translators as enlightenment. So it doesn't mean enlightenment in the way we use that word, for example, in the Western Theravada world. In the Western Theravada world, we use the word enlightenment to refer to full enlightenment, complete enlightenment. But this word, kaiwu, just means like a temporary opening of the mind, a stroke of insight. It doesn't necessarily mean complete enlightenment. It just means a temporary deepening of one's insight, or a sudden realization, but not necessarily a deep enlightenment experience. So that's created a lot of confusion because, again, in some Buddhist texts, you'll encounter the word enlightenment used in a relatively ordinary sense. But I would not consider someone who has just this temporary opening of mind, I wouldn't consider them an enlightened being. They're still subject to samsara. So yeah, all arhats and Buddhas are free of paticca-samuppada. Everybody else is still subject to it. Okay?
And Kevin asks, are you using mind and brain interchangeably? So when you talk about mechanics of the mind, you're referring to the machinery of the brain?
No, I never talk about brains. Hardly ever, actually. Yeah, I don't talk about brains. The mind is not the brain is not the mind. The brain is part of the body. So I don't pretend to know much about brains, just as I don't pretend to know much about lungs and hearts and kidneys and livers and so on. But I do pretend to know a little bit about the mind, which is not a physical thing, but it is something which operates on causes and conditions, which is why I refer to it as machinery on this occasion. Okay.
And Jill here has a question. I'd like to know which sutta teaches Vedana is a choice, as you said. I thought Vedana happens and clinging is optional.
So there's a number of discourses like this. There's one which I refer to from time to time. I'm going to see if I can find it briefly. If I can't find it briefly, I'll have to tell you later. But there's a short discourse where the Buddha very directly speaks about the ability that we have to change a pleasant feeling to an unpleasant feeling, or an unpleasant feeling to a pleasant feeling, or either one to a neutral feeling, or to go completely beyond all experience of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So you know the one I'm talking about, Aya.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, off the top of my head, know where it is. Yeah, I'm looking right now, but I'm not finding it. If you send me an email, I can find you the sutta reference. There's a number of places where the Buddha talks about this. Yeah, this is not the sutta. Send me an email. I'll find the sutta quote for you. I thought I had it here, but I'm not finding it now. Yeah, we should move on. But if you send me an email, I'll get you some sutta references.
Yeah. Without a human driver, then the car has no capability to operate. The car, therefore, has an I within its operation. Even the cars of today with artificial intelligence, there is still a self required to operate it. It seems this is a Theravada concept which is flawed on many levels.
That's an interesting viewpoint. Yeah, I see where you're coming from on that. Yeah.
That's it?
Yep, that's it.
All right. And Gita says, so Bhante asked to bodhisattvas, can they fade away with remainder to come back, fully aware of samsara, to teach us Dhamma similar to how the Sangha is teaching us now?
Well, you're assuming they ever left. So they do persist for a time. That much is clear. So an enlightened being doesn't just blink out of existence the moment they attain enlightenment. If they did, the Buddha would not have been around for another 45 years to continue teaching. Whether they persist after the death of the body, that's a more complex question, which the Buddha did not directly answer. Okay.
And Sally says, is it even dangerous when someone brings strong self-identity into enlightened goal, ignoring the worldly customs because she felt the reason is right, that is for enlightenment? It's actually hidden bhava underneath, even hard to aware for excuse of enlightened. This needs extreme caution, especially for Dhamma practitioners.
Yeah, so of course, substantial element of ego involved in trying to attain enlightenment, naturally. I want to attain enlightenment. Of course, there's a huge dose of self-attachment there. There's a huge dose of me and mine involved in that, of course. But in the process of trying to achieve that goal, then the self-attachment wears away. It's the self-attachment which leads to the end of self-attachment. It's terribly ironic, but it's the kind of irony that leads to full enlightenment, so I'm totally okay with it.
Right.
So it's the ego trying to let go of the ego. It's just fabulous. It's fabulous.
Right, thank you, Bhante. And Bradley says, in Samyutta Nikaya 35, 191, Venerable Sariputta tells Venerable Mahakotita that the I is not a fetter and neither are forms, but rather that the desire and passion which arises independent of them is the fetter. So the Buddha, for example, has an I and sees forms, but because he's ended craving there, he's released from suffering. Is this a good way to understand through this passion the six senses completely cease?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Bravo, Bradley! That was great. I love the sutta quote.
Yeah, I like it when you guys bring in other sutta quotes. It's quite illuminating.
Sally says, if so, I need to repent because I felt sometimes unintentionally ignored family members' feeling because fully dedicating in Dhamma and unaware they might feel hurt. This lack of compassion, which is away from Buddha's teachings.
Well, that's actually a different subject. So, what is more of a problem is that sometimes our self identity of being a Buddhist practitioner then winds up actually getting in the way of our practicing properly. So we think like, oh, I am a holy Buddhist. I do not involve myself with these lesser beings. Well, that's just arrogance. And that can lead to all kinds of hostility. Or we see somebody else who we think is not practicing as well as we are, and then we're like, you're sloppy, disgusting. Well, we're just fueling our own hostility and aversion. Once again, that's not doing anybody any good. It's just building up our own defilements. And actually, it can have a harmful effect because then other people think, oh, Buddhist practice makes you some kind of arrogant jerk. Well, count me out. I don't want to get wrapped up in that. So that is actually an example of where it's straying us off the path. So in that case, we need to remind ourselves, it's like, oh, this is actually getting off the path. I started with good intentions, but good intentions plus delusion equals bad results. So we need to constantly check ourselves and make sure that we're not straying off the Noble Eightfold Path into wrong speech or a lack of empathy or a lack of consideration or stinginess or hostility or anything of that sort. Instead, we should be trying to see, as the Buddha said over and over again, how can I be of benefit both to myself and to others? That's what we should constantly be asking. So don't neglect your family members, but also don't neglect your Buddhist practice. And in fact, these are not two different things. Caring about your family is also part of your practice. Okay?
And Bradley says, at which points along dependent origination is it possible to tinker? I realize that some teachers tend to focus on release from craving or feeling or clinging, but can there be release from mind and body, for example?
Yeah, actually, my understanding is that you can break the chain at any step. There tends to be an emphasis on the sense contact, feeling, craving, clinging part. So those 4 steps right in the middle. There tends to be an emphasis on that part because that's perhaps the easiest part to get involved in, the easiest part to start making changes. But technically, you can break the chain at any step. So yeah, if you want to work directly on letting go of delusion and attachment regarding mind and body, yeah, go for it. It's substantially harder, but it can be done. Yeah. But maybe for you, it'll be easier. Try it out.
Bradley also asks, what is parinibbana? He says, I'm full of questions today. My mind is pliable right now.
So parinibbana, I think that's a question for monk chat. So there's no monk chat on the schedule for
quite some time.
For the next week and a half.
Brief answer.
Brief answer. You want a brief answer about what parinibbana is? That's like the subject of an entire talk.
Let's do a subject talk.
Okay, there you go. There'll be a whole talk on this in about a week and a half or 2.
All right, and
simple answer, it's complete enlightenment. But yeah, that's so insufficient. No, I'll have to give a whole talk on the subject.
And Sally says, sometimes we thought we are following Buddha's teachings, but we're actually walking off the path because of delusion and right view not strong enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bradley also says, the irony that leads to the end of irony. Love it. Dan says, Bante 1215 is my favorite too. Just be with dukkha. I imagine Buddha drops the mic at the end, but this is, of course, imagination. No microphones existed 2,500 years ago. And
so now I'm just imagining the Buddha going like, boom. Anyway. No, the Buddha drops the mic all the time throughout the suttas, just metaphorically.
And Dan also asks, does an arahat have a preference to independent origination, or is it just arahats having developed the path fully have no preference for the arising or passing in the chain?
There's no preference, and there's no dependent origination. There is simply the persisting shadow of their residual karma. Okay.
And Dan says, thank you so much. This is the most interesting stuff in the world. Well, great. I'm glad you're enjoying Sutta study and all the Dharma programs that we've been offering. That's all for today. Thank you so much, Bante. Bradley says, tons of Dhamma Sukha. Yes, that's great. See, if you're a Greek type, you should focus on this right sukha. Dhamma Sukha is very good. All right, so we'll see you in less than 12 hours at 7:30 p.m. New York City time, to be exact, and we will be discussing the first parami today. So generosity, I believe we're talking about today.
I think so.
Correct.
Anyway.
And it might be Bante or it might be me, or it might be both. We'll see.
So this will be the fun thing as we start our 10 parami series, is you'll never know who the teacher is going to be day by day.
Yeah, featuring Mystery Monk. All right. May you have a great day and just a great in general. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May all beings attain awakening.
Yeah.